March 1969. Han Tre Island, off the coast of Vietnam, pitch black at 2 in the morning. Lieutenant Bob Kerrey leads 14 Navy SEALs up a 350-foot cliff, 60-pound packs, moving 1 yard per second. Intelligence says 15 Viet Cong are waiting at the top. What intelligence doesn't say is that this raid isn't hunting regular soldiers. It's hunting names on a list of 81,740 suspected enemy leaders that a secret program called Phoenix is systematically erasing from villages across South Vietnam. While most of the war burns through jungle sweeps and body counts, these small SEAL teams are playing a different game entirely. They're not chasing every rifle in the forest. They're tracking the 2 or 3 people per village who make the war actually run. The tax collectors, the recruiters, the quiet voices that turn farmers into fighters. Over 4 years, Navy SEALs will claim they captured nearly 30,000 of these shadow commanders. But tonight, as Kerry's men reach the ridge and grenades start exploding, the bigger question isn't whether Phoenix can break an insurgency by hunting names instead of counting bodies. It's whether the men doing the hunting can live with what those numbers really mean. The briefing room in Saigon hummed with the low whir of air conditioning units fighting the humid March heat of 1967. Maps covered every available wall surface, core zones marked in red ink, district boundaries traced in blue, and hundreds of colored pins marking where village chiefs had been assassinated in the past 6 months. The pins clustered heaviest in the Mekong Delta, where the Viet Cong had perfected the art of making local government disappear 1 bullet at a time. Colonel William Colby stood at the center of it all, his pressed khakis and quiet manner masking the fact that he was about to propose something revolutionary. The men around the table represented the old way of fighting this war. Brigade commanders who measured success in grid squares swept, body counts tallied, and bomb tonnage dropped. They had been doing this for 2 years now, moving entire battalions through the countryside at 5 to 10 miles per day, burning through helicopter fuel and artillery shells while the enemy melted away into the villages like smoke. "Gentlemen," Colby began, tapping a thin pointer against a detailed organizational chart, "we're fighting the wrong war." The chart showed something most of them had never seen before, a complete breakdown of how the Viet Cong actually functioned at village level. Not the guerrilla fighters with AK-47s that American units encountered in firefights, but the invisible political network that made those fighters possible. Village secretaries who collected rice taxes, hamlet security chiefs who recruited teenagers, district finance officers who moved money and supplies through networks that had been operating for decades. "This is the Viet Cong Infrastructure," Colby continued, using the bureaucratic term that would soon become synonymous with a new kind of warfare. The VCI. Every village has 2 to 3 people who make the communist war machine actually run. They don't carry rifles. They carry ledgers. They don't fight our patrols. They make sure our patrols never find anything worth fighting. He paused, letting the implications sink in. We don't need to kill all the guerrillas. We need to break the people who tell them where to go and what to do. The room fell silent except for the air conditioning. This was heresy. American doctrine since World War II had focused on destroying enemy forces through superior firepower and mobility. The idea of targeting specific individuals based on intelligence files sounded more like police work than warfare, but Colby had numbers that made the heresy hard to ignore. Post-Tet casualty reports showed that despite killing thousands of communist fighters, American units were encountering the same level of organized resistance in the same villages month after month. The Hydra was regrowing its heads faster than conventional operations could cut them off. Intelligence coordination and exploitation, Colby said, introducing the acronym that would soon evolve into something far more famous. ISEX. We're going to coordinate every source of information we have, police files, census data, prisoner interrogations, agent reports, and turn them into target lists. Then we're going to hunt those targets with small, precise teams instead of brigade-sized sweeps. The concept was elegant in its simplicity, but the execution would prove brutally complex. Within months, ICX would become the Phoenix program, named after the mythical Vietnamese bird that rises from ashes. District intelligence and operations coordinating centers would spread across all 4 core zones, each one maintaining blacklists of suspected VCI members ranked by priority and reliability of information. The South Vietnamese National Police would handle arrests in secure areas. Provincial Reconnaissance Units would go after targets in contested zones. And for the most dangerous missions, in areas where only the most skilled operators could survive, there were the Navy SEALs. The SEALs were perfect for this new kind of war, though few people understood why at first. SEAL platoons were tiny, just 14 to 16 men compared to rifle companies of over 100. They had been designed for coastal reconnaissance and underwater demolition, missions that required stealth and precision rather than overwhelming firepower. But in the maze of canals and rivers that made up the Mekong Delta, their skills translated perfectly to a different kind of target. A SEAL team could reach any hamlet in the Delta within hours using shallow draft boats, moving silently through waterways that larger units couldn't navigate. They could insert at night, grab specifics, individuals, and extract with prisoners and documents before dawn. Lieutenant Commander Roy Boehm, the man who had created the SEALs just 6 years earlier, watched the briefing with the satisfaction of seeing his unconventional warriors finally get an unconventional mission. "My guys don't need to hold ground," he would tell anyone who would listen. "They just need to find the right people and bring them back alive." The emphasis on alive was crucial. Dead men couldn't provide information, and information was becoming more valuable than body counts. The first Phoenix coordination meetings revealed just how much the Americans didn't know about their enemy. Files contained thousands of names, but most were aliases or outdated information. A single VCI member might appear in police records under 3 different names, in census data as a legitimate rice farmer, and in prisoner reports as someone's uncle who occasionally carried messages. The challenge wasn't finding suspected communists. The challenge was figuring out which suspects actually mattered and which were just relatives caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. But even as Phoenix took shape on paper, doubt crept into the planning sessions. A South Vietnamese district chief, whose name would never appear in official records, voiced what many were thinking during a late-night strategy meeting in Can Tho. "Sir," he said to his American advisor, "you're asking me to arrest a schoolteacher based on one prisoner's statement. I've known that man for 20 years. His children play with my children." The advisor checked his files, confirmed the reliability rating of the source, and made a notation in red ink. The schoolteacher's name stayed on the list. The system was designed to be objective, to remove personal relationships from targeting decisions. What it couldn't account for was the human cost of turning neighbors into numbers and friends into statistics on a classified ledger that would soon carry 81,740 names. The District Intelligence and Operations Coordinating Center in Can Tho looked more like a corporate planning room than a military command post. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, illuminating walls covered with organizational charts that resembled corporate flow diagrams more than battle maps. Each chart showed the Viet Cong Infrastructure broken down into neat boxes, province committee at the top, district committees below that, and village cells at the bottom. Names filled some boxes in careful block letters. Others remained blank, marked with question marks and reliability ratings that ranged from A1 for confirmed intelligence to F6 for rumors that might be completely fabricated. Captain James Parker, a Phoenix advisor fresh from the intelligence school at Fort Holabird, stood before the largest chart with a red grease pencil in his hand. He was learning that this new kind of war required a different kind of mathematics. Instead of calculating artillery trajectories and casualty ratios, he spent his days working through probability matrices that tried to turn human behavior into actionable intelligence. "Target number 47, he announced to the mixed group of American advisors and South Vietnamese officers gathered around a conference table. "Nguyen Van Duc, also known as Ba Duc, also known as Uncle 3, suspected district finance officer for Military Region 2. Last confirmed sighting, Vinh Long Province, November 68. The information on Ba Duc filled 3 manila folders. A defector had identified him as the man who collected rice taxes from 12 villages along the Mekong. A captured document mentioned someone called Uncle 3 authorizing payment to a local VC company. Aerial reconnaissance had photographed him at a funeral where known communists were also present. But none of this information, by itself, would hold up in any court. It was the kind of mosaic intelligence that Phoenix had been designed to process, fragments of truth that meant nothing alone but painted a clear picture when assembled correctly. "Reliability rating?" asked Major Nguyen Van Min, the South Vietnamese officer who would ultimately authorize any operation against Ba Duc. This was the crucial question that separated Phoenix from the random sweeps that had characterized earlier American operations. Every piece of intelligence received a grade. Every source had a track record. Every target had to meet minimum standards before a team would risk their lives hunting them. Source Alpha rates A2, Parker replied, consulting his notes. Previous information proved accurate in 4 separate incidents. Source Bravo rates B3, good track record but limited access. Document analysis rates A1, handwriting confirmed by previous samples. The numbers added up to a target worth pursuing, but they also revealed the fundamental challenge of the Phoenix program. Intelligence officers were asking 17- and 18-year-old soldiers to risk their lives based on mathematical calculations about human behavior patterns that might be completely wrong. 20 miles south, at a converted French colonial villa that served as a SEAL operating base, Lieutenant Tom Harrison was learning to translate those calculations into operational reality. Harrison commanded a SEAL platoon that had been attached to Phoenix operations for 6 months, and he had discovered that hunting specific people required completely different tactics than the ambushes and reconnaissance missions that SEALs had been trained for. "We're not looking for enemy units," he explained to his newest team member, Petty Officer Second Class Mike Rodriguez, who had just arrived from the SEAL training facility at Coronado. "We're looking for one guy who might be sleeping in any of 50 different houses, and we need to get him alive." The briefing room at the SEAL base reflected this new reality. Instead of tactical maps showing likely enemy positions, the walls were covered with detailed sketches of individual hamlets drawn by Vietnamese scouts. Every house was numbered. Every family's routine was documented. The most important intelligence concerned which doors opened inward and which opened outward, which houses had dogs, and which families traditionally went to bed before 9 o'clock. This was war reduced to the level of individual doorknobs and sleeping habits, and it required a precision that no military manual had ever contemplated. Rodriguez listened as Harrison walked him through the standard Phoenix raid profile. Insert by boat at 0200 hours, move 1,200 meters overland at 1 kilometer per hour, establish overwatch positions by 0330, hit the target house at 0400 when people sleep deepest, extraction by the same route, back to the boats before sunrise. The timeline sounded simple, but Harrison had learned that every element required split-second timing. Too early, and the target might still be awake. Too late, and dawn would expose the team during their withdrawal. The margin for error was measured in minutes, and mistakes usually meant either losing the target or losing team members. The weapons and equipment reflected this new precision. CAR-15 carbines had replaced the longer M16 rifles because SEALs needed something compact enough for close-quarters work inside village huts. Each rifle carried 30-round magazines taped together in pairs, jungle style, for fast reloading in darkness. The most crucial piece of equipment was the AN PVS-2 Starlight Scope, a 40,000 times light amplification device that could turn a moonless night into green daylight out to 400 yards. With the Starlight, a SEAL could identify individual faces at distances that would have been impossible with the naked eye, allowing teams to confirm they had the right target before moving in for capture. But technology could only solve part of the problem. The bigger challenge was cultural, and it required American operators to work more closely with Vietnamese allies than any previous operation had demanded. Provincial Reconnaissance Units provided the local knowledge that made Phoenix raids possible. PRU team leaders knew which village elder could be trusted, which paths were used by night fishermen who might compromise an operation, and most importantly, which potential targets were actually worth the risk. "The Americans bring the boats and the scopes," explained Sergeant First Class Tran Van Min, a PRU leader who had been working with SEALs for 8 months. "But we know which houses have steel doors and which have wooden ones. We know which families will fight and which will surrender quietly." The first joint SEAL-PRU operation that Harrison witnessed took place on a moonless night in December 1968, targeting a Hamlet finance officer whose tax collection records had been captured in an earlier raid. The intelligence was 6 days old, fresh by Phoenix standards, and rated B2 for reliability. 12 men moved through the darkness using hand signals and compass headings, their boats hidden 3 kilometers away in a canal that didn't appear on American maps but had been used by smugglers for generations. They reached the target house at exactly 4 in the morning, found it empty, and discovered that their target had moved to his wife's family home in a neighboring hamlet 2 days earlier. By Phoenix metrics, the operation was a failure. No capture, no documents, no actionable intelligence gained. But Harrison understood something that the metrics couldn't capture. The next morning, word spread through 5 hamlets that American forces had known exactly where to find a specific individual, had moved through the countryside without being detected, and had surrounded a house with surgical precision. The psychological effect was immediate and measurable. Village leaders who had previously ignored South Vietnamese government directives suddenly began cooperating with local officials. Rice tax collections dropped by 30% in the surrounding area. 3 suspected VC sympathizers requested transfers to government-controlled villages, claiming they feared for their safety. The revolution in warfare wasn't in the success of individual raids. It was in the cumulative effect of turning war from a random process into a predictable one. For the first time in Vietnam, American forces were demonstrating that they knew who their enemies were, where those enemies lived, and how to find them in the dark. The Viet Cong Infrastructure had built its power on anonymity and fear. Phoenix was stripping away both advantages one name at a time, replacing the chaos of conventional warfare with the cold mathematics of systematic manhunting. The intelligence briefing at Nha Trang on March 13, 1969, should have been routine. Lieutenant Junior Grade Bob Kerrey sat in a sweltering Quonset hut listening to a CIA case officer describe what appeared to be a textbook Phoenix target, a suspected Viet Cong district headquarters operating from Han Tre Island, a rocky outcropping 6 miles east of Cam Ranh Bay. The island rose 350 feet from the South China Sea like a green fortress, its steep cliffs and dense vegetation providing perfect concealment for enemy operations. Aerial reconnaissance had identified cooking fires and temporary structures that suggested 15 to 20 enemy personnel, including what intelligence analysts believed were senior political cadres coordinating communist activities across Can Hoa province. Priority is capture of leadership personnel and any documents, the briefing officer emphasized, tapping his pointer against a topographical map that showed the island's forbidding terrain. Secondary objective is disruption of communications equipment. Rules of engagement. Are capture preferred, but you're authorized to use necessary force if resistance is encountered. The language was clinical, reducing what would become one of the most harrowing nights of the Vietnam War to a series of tactical objectives and legal parameters that meant nothing once the shooting started. Kerrey studied the map with the methodical attention to detail that had carried him through BUDS training and 6 months of combat operations with SEAL Team 1. At 25, he had already led more night raids than most infantry officers would see in an entire tour. But Han Tre presented unique challenges that separated it from the flat terrain of the Mekong Delta, where Phoenix operations typically unfolded. The island had exactly one beach suitable for landing, a narrow strip of sand at the base of the cliff that would leave his team completely exposed during their approach. From there, they would have to climb nearly vertical rock faces in complete darkness while carrying 60 pounds of equipment per man, then move over broken ground to reach the suspected enemy positions near the island's peak. The 14 SEALs who would make the assault represented the cutting edge of American military capability in 1969. Each man carried a CAR-15 carbine with 4 30-round magazines taped in pairs for rapid reloading. Kerrey himself carried an M79 grenade launcher in addition to his rifle, giving the small unit firepower equivalent to a much larger conventional force. But their real advantage was training that emphasized speed, surprise, and violence of action concentrated into the smallest possible time window. Phoenix Doctrine called for raids to last no more than 15 minutes from initial contact to extraction, based on the assumption that longer operations would allow enemy reinforcements to arrive and trap the assault force. The approach to Han Tre began at 0030 hours on March 14th, with 2 Navy patrol boats carrying the SEAL team through moderate seas under a moonless sky. Kerrey watched the island's dark silhouette grow larger through his binoculars, mentally rehearsing the complex sequence of movements that would be required once they hit the beach. The boats would idle their engines and glide the final 200 yards to avoid detection by enemy sentries. The SEALs would slip over the side into chest-deep water and wade ashore in single file, maintaining 5-yard intervals to minimize casualties if they walked into an ambush. From the beach, they would have exactly 90 minutes to climb the cliff, locate and assault the enemy positions, complete their search for prisoners and documents, and return to the extraction point before dawn made their withdrawal impossible. The climb proved more difficult than anyone had anticipated. What appeared manageable on aerial photographs became a nightmare of loose rock and thorny vegetation that caught equipment and made silent movement impossible. Kerrey led from the front, testing each handhold before committing his full weight, acutely aware that a single dislodged stone could alert enemy sentries and compromise the entire operation. Behind him, his men struggled with radio equipment, medical supplies, and ammunition that seemed to grow heavier with each vertical foot they gained. The physical demands were enormous, but the psychological pressure was worse. Every sound echoed off the rock faces. Every minute of delay increased the risk that dawn would catch them exposed on the cliff face. They reached the top at 02:15, 15 minutes behind schedule, but still within the operational window that would allow them to complete their mission and extract before sunrise. Kerrey used hand signals to deploy his men in a loose skirmish line, then began the careful advance toward the suspected enemy positions. The starlight scope revealed what appeared to be several temporary structures built into natural cave formations, with no signs of movement or activity. For a moment, Kerrey wondered if the intelligence had been wrong, if they had risked 14 lives climbing an impossible cliff to assault an abandoned position. The question was answered when a trip flare ignited 50 yards ahead, bathing the entire area in harsh white light that destroyed their night vision and announced their presence to every enemy soldier on the island. Kerrey's training took over automatically. He dropped to one knee and began returning fire toward muzzle flashes that appeared among the rocks ahead, while shouting orders to his scattered team members. "Contact front, shift left, watch your fields of fire." The careful tactical plan dissolved into the chaos that defines all combat, where survival depends on individual decisions made in fractions of seconds by men who can barely see beyond their rifle barrels. The grenade that changed everything landed between Kerrey and his radio operator, a perfectly thrown frag that bounced once off a rock ledge before exploding with devastating effect. Kerrey felt the blast wave lift him off his feet and slam him backward into a boulder, then looked down to see that his right leg below the knee was essentially gone, held together by strips of torn flesh and shattered bone. The pain was immediate and overwhelming, but his tactical mind continued functioning with crystalline clarity. He was the platoon leader. His men were under fire and taking casualties. The mission required someone to maintain command and control until they could break contact and withdraw to the extraction point. "Corpsman!" Kerrey shouted, though he knew their medic was already treating other wounded team members. He pulled a tourniquet from his web gear and applied it to his own leg with hands that shook from blood loss and shock, then keyed his radio to call for naval gunfire support from the destroyers operating offshore. The next 20 minutes became a blur of muzzle flashes, radio calls, and the methodical process of coordinating fire and movement that allowed his team to disengage from superior enemy forces and begin the nightmare descent back down the cliff face. The documents they recovered during those chaotic minutes would prove crucial to Phoenix operations across 3 provinces. A notebook containing coded references to safe houses in Nha Trang led to the identification of 6 previously unknown VCI members. Financial records showed rice tax collection quotas that helped American analysts understand how the communist infrastructure funded its operations. Radio frequencies and call signs compromised an entire enemy communications network that had been operating undetected for months. By any objective measure, the raid was a complete success that advanced Phoenix objectives and dealt a serious blow to communist capabilities in the region. But as Kerrey lay in the hospital ship's operating room 12 hours later, watching surgeons work to save what remained of his leg, success felt like a concept that belonged to someone else's war. The Medal of Honor citation would emphasize his leadership under fire and his refusal to accept medical evacuation until all his men were safe. The Phoenix After Action report would catalog the intelligence gained and the enemy capabilities disrupted. Neither document would capture what Kerrey was beginning to understand about the true cost of turning war into a systematic process of hunting human beings through villages and onto islands where they fought back with everything they had. The statistics room at the Phoenix Directorate in Saigon had become a shrine to numerical precision by early 1970. Wall charts tracked neutralizations by month, province, and method of capture. Computer printouts, still a novelty in military operations, calculated success ratios, and target acquisition rates with decimal point accuracy. The numbers painted a picture of systematic success that would have been impossible to imagine 3 years earlier. 81,740 suspected Viet Cong infrastructure members neutralized, 26,369 killed in action, the remainder captured, detained, or convinced to defect to the South Vietnamese government. Colonel Robert Guard studied these figures with the skepticism of a professional soldier who had learned to distrust any statistic that looked too clean. As the new Phoenix director, he inherited not just an operational program, but a public relations nightmare that was beginning to undermine American support for the entire war effort. Congressional hearings had turned Phoenix into a symbol of everything wrong with American involvement in Southeast Asia. Newspaper editorials described it as an assassination program that murdered innocent civilians and tortured prisoners in violation of international law. The numbers that looked so impressive on Saigon briefing charts meant nothing if they destroyed American political will to continue fighting. 30,000 captured by SEAL teams alone, Guard read from the latest operational summary prepared by Navy Special Warfare Command. More than 20,000 enemy killed while resisting capture by Phoenix forces. The mathematics were staggering when considered alongside the known facts about SEAL team strength in Vietnam. At peak deployment, the Navy never had more than 200 SEALs operating in country at any given time, organized into platoons of 14 to 16 men. If the official statistics were accurate, those small teams had been responsible for more than a third of all Phoenix neutralizations across a 4-year period. The plausibility question had been nagging at intelligence analysts for months. Captain David Matthews, a Phoenix staff officer with a background in operational research, had been quietly running his own calculations using classified deployment records and after-action reports. "Sir," he told Guard during a private briefing, "the math only works if every SEAL team was conducting successful capture operations almost every night for 4 straight years. That assumes perfect intelligence, no operational failures, no weather delays, no equipment problems, and no enemy countermeasures." Matthews paused to let the implications sink in. It also assumes that every person captured was actually VCI, not just someone who happened to be in the wrong place when the team showed up. The reality was more complex than either the critics or the supporters wanted to acknowledge. SEAL and PRU teams were conducting nightly operations across all 4 core zones, often targeting multiple objectives during single missions. A typical raid might seek 3 specific suspects, but end up detaining 10 people for questioning, including family members, neighbors, and anyone else found at the target location. Processing these detainees through the Phoenix system created statistical artifacts that made individual operations appear more successful than they actually were. 3 high-value targets might become 10 neutralizations in the monthly reports, even if 7 of the detainees were released within days after proving their innocence. The enemy's perspective revealed a different truth about Phoenix effectiveness. Le Duan, the Communist Party secretary who effectively controlled North Vietnamese strategy after Ho Chi Minh's death, had identified Phoenix as the most dangerous threat to revolutionary success in the South. Internal party documents captured by American forces showed that VCI casualties had reached crisis levels by 1970. Village party secretaries were sleeping in different locations every night. District committees had been forced to operate from remote jungle camps rather than established villages. The rice tax collection system that funded communist military operations had been disrupted across entire provinces. "Our comrades in the villages live in constant fear," wrote one district political officer in a report that American intelligence intercepted. "Every list of names becomes a death warrant. Every informant becomes a potential executioner. The enemy knows our structure better than we know theirs." The psychological impact extended beyond individual casualties. Phoenix had succeeded in making the invisible infrastructure visible, forcing communist organizers to operate like hunted criminals rather than revolutionary leaders with popular support. But success in disrupting enemy operations did not translate into success in winning Vietnamese hearts and minds, and the distinction was becoming crucial as American domestic support for the war collapsed. Village chiefs who cooperated with Phoenix found themselves targeted by communist assassination squads. Families whose sons joined Provincial Reconnaissance Units were marked for retaliation. The program that was designed to protect rural populations from communist coercion had created new cycles of violence that made neutrality impossible for ordinary Vietnamese caught between competing forces. Nguyen Thi Mai, a school teacher in Dinh Tuong Province, embodied the human complexity that Phoenix statistics could not capture. Her father had been detained during a SEAL raid in '69, held for 2 weeks at a district interrogation center, then released without charges when investigators concluded he was not the finance cadre they were seeking. The official record showed him as detained and released, a successful discrimination between guilty and innocent that proved the system's restraint and professionalism. But Mai's family experienced something different. Their neighbors began avoiding them, afraid that association with a suspected communist would bring Phoenix attention to their own households. Her father lost his job as a Hamlet clerk. Her brother was denied admission to Saigon University because his file contained the detention record. The political damage was becoming impossible for Phoenix supporters to ignore. Television cameras brought images of detainees and interrogation centers into American living rooms every night. Senators who had initially supported the program began demanding investigations. The Central Intelligence Agency, which had created Phoenix as a precise alternative to conventional military operations, found itself defending a program that critics portrayed as indistinguishable from terrorism. William Colby, now CIA director, spent more time testifying before Congress than managing operations in Southeast Asia. The final blow came from an unexpected source, the South Vietnamese government that Phoenix had been designed to support. President Nguyen Van Thieu, facing his own political pressures, began distancing himself from American-directed operations that appeared to bypass South Vietnamese sovereignty. By 1971, most Phoenix functions had been transferred to South Vietnamese control under programs with different names but similar objectives. American advisors remained, but their role was officially limited to training and logistics support. Colonel Guard's last act as Phoenix director was to review the program's final statistical summary. The numbers remained impressive by any military standard, more enemy infrastructure personnel neutralized than any conventional campaign had achieved. But the cost had become impossible to justify in a war that America was determined to exit regardless of tactical success. The lists that had once seemed like the key to victory had become symbols of a conflict that had lost any clear definition of what victory would mean. Phoenix had proven that insurgencies could be systematically disrupted through precise intelligence and targeted operations. It had not proven that disrupting insurgencies could win wars that lacked popular support at home or sustainable political objectives in the field. The program that began as a blueprint for a new kind of warfare ended as evidence that even perfect tactics could not overcome flawed strategy in a conflict that Americans no longer believed was worth fighting. The darkness over Quang Tri Province on October 31, 1972, carried the weight of a war entering its final phase. American ground combat units had withdrawn under President Nixon's Vietnamization policy, leaving behind small advisory teams and special operations forces to support South Vietnamese efforts against a North Vietnamese army that was growing bolder by the month. Lieutenant Thomas Norris crouched in elephant grass 3 kilometers behind enemy lines, studying a coastal village through binoculars, while his mixed American-South Vietnamese team prepared for what would become the last great demonstration of Phoenix tactical doctrine. The mission had nothing to do with Phoenix officially. That program had been quietly dissolved under congressional pressure 2 years earlier. But the operational DNA was identical. Precise intelligence about specific individuals, small teams moving undetected through hostile territory, and capture operations designed to yield information rather than body counts. Norris and his team were hunting 2 North Vietnamese officers believed to be coordinating artillery strikes against South Vietnamese positions around the ancient city of Hue. The intelligence was 6 hours old, rated A2 for reliability, and suggested the targets would be meeting local contacts in a house 50 meters from the beach. Petty Officer First Class. Michael Thornton moved through the grass beside Norris with the fluid silence that had made SEAL teams legendary throughout the Mekong Delta. At 28, Thornton had spent 5 years perfecting the art of small unit operations that Phoenix had refined into systematic warfare. He carried the same CAR-15 carbine that had armed SEAL teams since '68, loaded with tracer rounds that would help coordinate fire if the mission went wrong. But unlike the early Phoenix raids that prioritized capture over killing, this operation was authorized to use maximum force. The war was ending, and final operations carried a finality that made everyone involved understand the stakes differently. The approach to the target house followed patterns that had been rehearsed thousands of times across 4 core zones during the Phoenix years. 2-man teams established overwatch positions with fields of fire that covered all escape routes. Radio checks confirmed that supporting fire was available from offshore naval units. The assault element moved forward using hand signals and predetermined timing that allowed complex maneuvers to unfold without verbal communication. Every aspect of the operation reflected lessons learned from hunting Viet Cong Infrastructure members in villages where a single mistake could compromise entire networks of intelligence sources. The first indication that something was wrong came when Thornton's Starlight scope revealed defensive positions that intelligence reports had not mentioned. What was supposed to be a simple meeting between 2 officers and their local contacts had become a prepared ambush involving at least a full platoon of North Vietnamese regulars. Norris keyed his radio to abort the mission, but incoming fire from multiple directions made withdrawal impossible. The team was pinned down in open terrain with enemy forces closing from 3 sides and dawn approaching fast enough to eliminate any chance of reaching the extraction point. Thornton's response demonstrated everything that Phoenix Doctrine had tried to achieve in terms of individual initiative and tactical flexibility. Instead of following standard procedures that called for defensive positions and calls for supporting fire, he moved toward the heaviest enemy concentration while directing his Vietnamese teammates to establish covering fire. The logic was counterintuitive, but sound, surprise, and violence of action could break enemy momentum even when numerical odds were hopeless. He threw grenades into enemy positions, called out target locations for his team's return fire, and maintained radio contact with offshore support units that were coordinating naval gunfire. The explosion that nearly killed Norris came from a B-40 rocket that detonated close enough to cause massive head trauma and leave him unconscious with severe bleeding from multiple wounds. Thornton found him face down in surf that was turning red with blood, apparently dead from injuries that would have been immediately fatal to most men. But Phoenix operations had taught SEAL teams that assumptions about what was possible could be wrong, that individuals could survive damage that looked unsurvivable, and that missions succeeded or failed based on decisions made in seconds when there was no time to think through consequences. Thornton lifted Norris onto his shoulders and began the 3-hour swim to reach American naval forces operating offshore. The physical demands were extraordinary, supporting the weight of another man while swimming in moderate seas, maintaining a heading without compass references, and staying conscious despite his own wounds and exhaustion. But the psychological demands were equally challenging. Thornton was making a decision that violated tactical doctrine by risking 2 lives instead of accepting the loss of 1. He was choosing loyalty to an individual over mission accomplishment, personal commitment over professional calculation. The rescue created a legend that would outlast the war and influence special operations doctrine for decades. Both men received the Medal of Honor, Norris for his earlier rescue of downed airmen, Thornton for the swim that saved Norris's life. But the deeper significance lay in what their story revealed about the transformation of warfare that Phoenix had represented. Small teams with perfect intelligence could achieve results impossible for larger conventional forces. Individual relationships between operators could matter more than formal command structures. Success in unconventional warfare depended on human factors that no amount of technological superiority could replace. 3 years later, as North Vietnamese tanks rolled through Saigon streets, a CIA officer named Frank Snepp sat in his office destroying files that contained thousands of names collected during the Phoenix years. Each folder represented someone who had been identified, investigated, and often captured or killed based on intelligence that American forces had spent 4 years gathering and analyzing. Some files contained photographs of individuals who had been detained and released. Others held death certificates for village officials who had been assassinated by communist hit squads in retaliation for cooperating with Phoenix operations. Snepp paused over a file that contained a single sheet of paper with 3 names written in careful block letters. 2 names had been crossed out in red ink. The third was circled in blue, with a notation that the individual had been relocated for protective reasons in 1971. He would never know whether that person survived the war, whether the protection had been effective, or whether the intelligence that put his name on a Phoenix list had been accurate. The systematic approach that had seemed so promising in 1967 was ending in the random destruction of records that represented 4 years of careful work by thousands of people who had believed they were fighting for something that mattered. The conceptual legacy of Phoenix survived the tactical defeat in Vietnam. When American forces entered Iraq in 2003, they carried with them operational procedures that were direct descendants of Phoenix methodology. Digital databases replaced index cards. Satellite communications replaced PRC-25 radios. Night vision equipment advanced beyond recognition. But the fundamental approach remained identical. Identify key individuals within insurgent networks. Develop precise intelligence about their locations and activities. Then use small special operations teams to capture or kill them with minimal collateral damage. The quiet revolution that began in Saigon briefing rooms had become the standard template for American counterinsurgency operations worldwide. Phoenix had not saved South Vietnam, but it had proven that wars could be fought with surgical precision when political objectives supported tactical innovation. The side that knew the most names, understood the most relationships, and could act on intelligence faster than enemies could adapt would control the tempo of any conflict regardless of conventional military balance. In places where Americans no longer had the luxury of massive firepower or unlimited time, the Phoenix model offered the only path to victory that domestic political constraints would allow. The program that failed to win the war it was designed for had become the foundation for every war that followed.